Hello, welcome back to SiggyTube and welcome to part 2 of Starting Points. Now, I want to make a series of different videos that are focusing on how I personally go about the creative process and composing. You probably gathered by now that I'm a real advocate of feel and kind of almost a hippie-like approach to something that is going to take on its own life in terms of an idea. Sometimes, by the way, that can be scribbling something down on a piece of paper, and I certainly do that a lot. Having said that, this is a focal point on trying to force an idea and not know what's going to happen. Now, in the last video we looked at the bass guitar and we picked literally a random shape, so that we could come up with something with that random shape, and from that random shape have something that could be developed into an entire track. Okay. Now, for this particular video I want to focus on melody. What do I mean by that? Well, melody for me is still probably the most important part of the composition process and the songwriting process. It really goes back to the old saying of the old grey whistle test. And I don't know if you know the story of what the old grey whistle test was based upon, but it was a group of cleaners, old ladies basically, who were cleaning studios, and there was this kind of fable that if a band was working on a tune in the studio and the old greys, i.e. the cleaners, started to whistle that tune, then the tune was going to be a success, i.e. the old grey whistle test. I think there's a lot to be said in the idea of a tune, and that's what I want to focus on. So, having been involved in bands and the writing process, and still involved in the writing process, I can pretty confidently say that most people write with coming up with a chord sequence. Okay, and they will come up with a chord sequence and put a melody to the chord sequence. So what we're going to do today is try and provoke some kind of melodic content that I will then, in the next video, go on to chord, and then we can discuss some of the chording kind of theory or aspects of how we might go about it. So essentially we have a completely blank canvas. I'm going to use the guitar as my blank canvas, but because it's melody, it could be anything. The primary point for me to get into the mindset is that I'm going to be inspired by a particular sound or feel. Now, for me, the guitar offers me something that is very expressive in a similar way to the vocal, but without the restrictions of the range of a vocal, and without kind of having to worry about words as well. I've always been self-conscious about la-ing and going and all that, but sometimes actually it's the best way of coming up with a melody. So what do I usually do? Well, I come up with a sound that I'm going to use on my instrument that hopefully inspires me. And just by being inspired by a sound or a tone, then I'm going to focus in on the fact that I can express myself. Okay, this comes back to the very first video that I made about finding the note. Okay, that depends on the actual tone. So I've got a different guitar today, and this is a mahogany guitar, so it has a slightly different vibe to some of the other guitars I have. So let's put the guitar on and let's just put some kind of clean sound. Okay, let's get this sound up. Now, this guitar's got various pickup combinations. I like my guitars to have a three-way. I'm a big fan of having a three-way switch on the pickups in my guitars, especially if they're humbuckers, because you get three tonal variations. You get the humbucking sound, the single coil sound, and the parallel sound. So between these two pickups we can switch them both on and then have a combination. Each one of those sounds is going to inspire me in a different way. So let's start off with a simple tone. Okay. Now, unlike before when I was working to a rhythm, I'm not really interested in the rhythm. What I'm interested in doing is kind of picking up on some phrasing. The phrasing was a very pivotal thing for me to develop playing scales. Very mindful of, if you play scales and just kind of practice, that's going to be really dull. So what I would do when I was younger would be, okay, that would be the shape of a major, for instance, but then I'd start to divide it up in different ways. Now by doing that, my ear would then go towards certain notes and melodic phrases. So first of all, I'm giving myself the right to play things wrong, if that makes sense. I'm not really thinking about the scales, I'm not really thinking about music theory. I know music theory, but I'm not thinking about it. I'm completely washing that out of the window for a minute. And I'm focusing on how I want the actual notes to sound. And that's why it's kind of important that I like the sound I'm playing. Because if I like the sound, I can dig into the sound. And immediately my ear starts to go into something. Okay, so let me just mess around again. Okay, so immediately these four notes have hit some kind of resonance with me right now. Don't know why. Sounds a bit melancholy. Okay. Now I could relate that to a harmonic minor, but I'm not interested in the theoretical side. What I'm interested in is getting some kind of earworm on the go. I'm going to start recording so that if I actually find something, I don't want to miss it. That's certainly not something we want to do. So I've got my tracks recording here. Make sure that it works. Okay, I'm going to go back to that original sound. So I'm messing around. I can kind of sense where maybe I want to go. That's where I want it to go, look. We've got a little phrase there. Now, that phrase for me is a really good little starting point, okay? Now let me actually see if I can be a bit more inspired by actually different sound and a different kind of vibe that I would give. One of my favourite sounds is this kind of slight distortion. So I quite like that. So let's repeat. Okay, there's a little phrase there straight away. Da, 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 da. Okay, just a small sound. Now, from that, I'm not going to try and create the chords or anything yet. What I'm going to try to do is to move that melody forward. I don't want to be reliant upon the fact that repetition is going to necessarily dictate where that goes. What do I mean by that? Well, if I come to a chord for a second and I was to pick just a normal E chord, if I was having a melody with an E, it almost dictates where that melody should go back to. I want to look at chords with you guys and splitting them up slightly differently, deliberately splitting them up, not necessarily on the one or even on the two, putting them in different places. So where can this go? Now you knew that it was supposed to go there. That's the kind of obvious place that the ear would pull it to. But that we can be deliberately kind of provocative and go to different places. That clearly doesn't work. That doesn't work. That works. So we can start to use some theory if we were kind of on top of where we should be hearing where it goes. And this is one of the interesting points that I wanted to make about melody. Often melody itself will dictate where it wants to go because there are resting points, there are cadences within a phrase that you will naturally feel comfortable or right in going to. Now, it's a really important thing to, I think, to spend some time working out where those places are and where they feel right. So we've got the now I could repeat that again. Now be interesting, wouldn't it, if I went like that? The difference between a provocative melody and a jam on the guitar is a pretty minimal kind of, depends which part of the fence you're sitting on. As guitarists, we're too kind of interested, I think, sometimes in following the technique and in terms of what we could or couldn't do. As a lyricist, we might be very similar in the way that we're developing our words. But if we're looking at melody, sometimes it's really about simplifying the notes so the notes can make the difference. And yes, there is some kind of grand type of scheme in terms of what goes together, and you can start to work out what your intervals sound like between various notes. The problem with doing that is that becomes an intellectual pursuit, and if you're worrying about where your intervals lie as you're doing it, you're missing out on the fact that it's the feel that is going to generate an emotion. Just by the 4 notes that I first picked, have a just have some kind of reaction with me right now. If I do this tomorrow, might be completely different again. And that's another thing, catching the moment with a particular thought or feeling against that melody is really, really important. Immediately, the jamming aspect can take us into another place. So I have that initial phrase, I could find it on the guitar, or I could go away from my instrument into my own mind and start to think, well, where might it go? And that's where we can do that kind of note recognition part that I've mentioned before. So imagine that I went now I need to find that. There we go. A combination of using the hearing and letting your mind wander and coming back to the instrument means that the melody can start to develop. Straight away, I feel good about that melody. I don't know about the words that I might put to it. I might keep it as an instrumental. Chances are, though, it will turn into a song. Da, 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 da. Once that melody, though, is associated itself with a certain feel and a certain kind of vibe that it's created, coming up with an idea for the song or a kind of vibe or theme or feel will almost dictate where it's going to go. Okay. Now 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, I had no idea whether anything would come out of that. And that's the point about these starting block little videos that we're doing. It's to get you to think about it completely differently. So I've got a little phrase here that I will develop. I'll develop that not on the camera because it'll bore you all senseless, but I'll come back with a fully developed melody that's based upon here that then we'll worry about chording, okay? And here's the thing though, I'm not allowed to use the guitar to do the chording. I deliberately don't want to. Why? Because it's going to make me think about that melody away from the main instrument that it came up on. And I think that's a really positive thing as well. So if you're a keyboard player, or you're a bass player, or you're a guitar player, deliberately come up with another instrument that you're going to try and chord those melodies upon. Because you don't want to get locked into doing things the same way. And the first thing that you're going to probably always do is resort to the things that are comfortable. And the problem with things that are comfortable, they tend to be pretty boring, unless you're completely nuts and you were born like Frank Zappa. Then you're probably not gonna go down that route. So the one most important point about working a melody through is that the melody should dictate the vibe. And for a melody to dictate a vibe and essentially pass the old grey whistle test, it has to be simple. That's one of the problems with guitarists in particular, but maybe most musicians. Because once you learn to play guitar, the natural progression for most guitarists is I want to fill notes. As many notes as possible. Fill them in. Look, I can play fast, or I can play this lick or that lick or whatever. That's kind of missing the point about melody. Melody sometimes can be really simple. If you can feel good about what you're doing on your instrument and live in the moment of that particular sound and note, then you're probably going to find it a lot easier to find a melody, because you're not having to kind of impress, or you're not having to intellectualize something. And what's the first melodies that we always remember? They're always nursery rhymes, you know. So be kind on yourself and give yourself the time and the space to go out on a real kind of exploration limb of the relationship of these simple notes and what they could mean as a melody. You know, pick one of your favourite songs and learn to play the melody. And learn to play the melody really, really simply. You know, we said Bar Bar Black Sheep a minute ago, but literally see what those sounds and those intervals are, because they will inadvertently draw you in a certain way. And make sure that you understand the difference between what essentially becomes a solo against what is a good melodic motif. Again, it's about starting blocks, so we're not interested in writing an entire piece, but what we are interested in is setting the scene, the scene to be set, because once that's set, the song or the composition will write itself. It will take you on that journey, providing it feels right when you start. And that depends on the mood you're in at the time, and it also depends on the vibe that you're trying to create. So I hope this kind of makes sense, but I really think you should have a go at it. I do it for hours. So I've got some work to do now to develop the melody into a cohesive piece of music that can actually give me some kind of structure. And then of course we can start to chord it. And that's where I want to come back to. I've been writing like this for quite a long time. I used to do it much more in my head than on my instrument, but as I got older, I realized that the actual symbiosis, I suppose, of being able to play an instrument and make that a living melody becomes something that is more inspiring to write with. One of the first ones I wrote when I was a teenager was a very simple motif, and it went like this, and it ended up into a track called Stardust in Your Mind. It went like this. Really simple, but from that little motif I got a whole song, and that happens many times. So if you don't write like that and you've never tried writing like that, I strongly recommend it. So I'll see you next time, where we'll get some chords together for this track.